Okay. So with this, we invite our second plenary speaker of the session. We are privileged to have with us Dr. Trina Banerjee, who is an assistant professor of Cultural Studies, Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Kolkata. Professor Banerjee is proceeded to complete her Masters of Studies in English at the University of Oxford. For her PhD, she worked on a history of women in the group theatre movement in Bengal between 1950 and 1980. She has also been researching the interfaces between women's movement and political theatre in contemporary Manipur for several years now. Between 2011 and 2013, she taught at the Theatre and Performance Studies Department at the School of Arts and Aesthetics in Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her research interests include gender, performance, political theatre, theories of the body, post-colonial theatre, and South Asian history. She has also been a theatre and film actress, as well as a journalist and a fiction writer. Her book, Performing Silence: Women in the Group Theatre Movement in Bengal, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press around this year. Privileged to have you, Dr. Trina Banerjee. Over to you.
Am I audible?
Absolutely, yes, ma'am. Both audible and visible.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Shubhro and everyone else at Amity for asking me to be part of this. I've been attending the sessions for the last 2 days. There have been some technical glitches, but everything I was able to hear was really, really stimulating. And as we know, all of us have been kind of stuck in these little boxes for a while, and so it's nice to actually have the semblance of some kind of a conversation. So that being said, my paper today is called, I decided to call it Without Assembly, Performance and Politics in the Face of Isolation. This is not, in fact, a completed structured paper of any kind. It's more like a string of thoughts that I've had over the period of the last 4 months about questions of what the pandemic entails, how we think about performance vis-a-vis this absolutely unprecedented new situation where isolation seems perforce to be necessary. And I will try to explore how this question of the prohibition of assembly, to put simply, the inability to gather together physically in a space, what that entails, particularly for how we think about performance and how we think about political performance, and in fact sort of prods many of us who've been sort of scholars of performance studies and student and teachers of performance studies to rethink, go back to many of our foundational theories and debates, and wonder what this does to sort of performance, both theoretically how we think about it and on the ground for practitioners. So I've been following practitioners and theoreticians who've been writing on and off briefly about sort of reflecting on these questions about how what does a performer do during a pandemic such as this? What does a performer do when he is disallowed from having a live audience? And various things have in fact come up. So the first one of them is the question of what really entails when we try to move performance from a live physical space to a digital medium. Right, so a lot of performers we know have been in the last, few months trying to sort of find alternatives of, of sort of live performance in the digital world. So they've tried to kind of perform digitally, perform live, recorded their performances, and then sort of disseminated them. So all of this actually also leads us to question what actually happens to performance when you sort of take away that quality of being in proximity in the same space. So questions about the textures of digital production of performance. What does it do to performance? Does performance remain performance if you sort of move it to the virtual world? In the context of this, because many performers have actually moved to digital mediums, they've also moved to offering online classes and all of that. And there's, of course, a completely sort of economic aspect to this, because of the many sort of demographies of people that have been affected by the pandemic. Performers are also and artists in general have also been deeply affected by the absolute economic collapse in some cases that the pandemic has entailed. So performers have had to sort of sign out of regular shows. They do not have a regular source of income. So many of the avenues that are regularly available are now closed. So in fact, a lot of performers have, out of both creative impulses and economic necessity, moved online. They're offering classes online. They're taking classes online. They're performing online. In the case of Bengal, of course, we know that a lot of artists have actually performed online in order to raise funds for relief, very crucial work after the Amphan cyclone as well. But while this has been one trend, and performers have been trying to sort of adjust to this kind of new mode of circulation, on the other hand, there have also been reflections from certain performers and practitioners and theoreticians both about the need for a pause. Whether or not this anxiety of production entailed by the fact that one's normal venues and sort of spaces of practice have been taken away, and the need to continue to produce no matter what the conditions outside, digitally or in the virtual space, in fact needs to be thought through. In the sense, what is the kind of anxiety that the artist feels when these normal avenues are taken away, and what is this need to constantly be sort of producing something? So whether or not there is in fact the need for a pause in production, the need to actually think through why one is moving from one medium to the other. This, of course, entails a certain amount of privilege when one doesn't, in fact, need to make a living from one's performance practice. But also, I think, in a certain way, certain questions that have been raised in the broader sort of world of sort of social theory around the pandemic also pertain to the world of performance. For example, we have realized over the last 4 months that a lot of labor, a lot of work that was in fact done invisibly behind the scenes, and a lot of that work is also feminized, as we know, what we would call generally care work, has in fact now begun to seem absolutely central to our survival in a situation like this. So, in fact, we find that those who we consider top-level workers and top-level sort of officials in a neoliberal capitalist economy are the least essential for survival during a pandemic. So we need nurses, we need care workers, we need those who know how to care for the aged and the ill, and all of these people, in fact, are in general mostly sort of invisibilized in the world of production. So there have been questions raised by feminists internationally, include the work of Tithi Bhattacharya comes to mind, where we actually begin to think of social reproduction as opposed to merely production as important, and also thinking of how the feminization of care work, in fact, is a part of a certain sort of conglomerate of patriarchy and capital in a certain way. And these questions also pertain to the world of performance, whether or not, in fact, we begin to look off stage into the world of the preparation for performance, the what is entailed in the world of technicians, those who take care of groups, keep them together, provide food, make sure things run on schedule, all of those very non-glamorous aspects of performance work. I think, in a sense, this question about the sort of the reproduction of the group or the company, the roles that are in fact invisible and backstage and marginalized, need to be also thought when we take a pause at this moment. there has been the argument that in some senses digital dissemination is more accessible, in the sense that one is not actually, spending a lot in putting up the production, in printing tickets, brochures, etc., etc. And interesting, a lot of these responses have actually come from the first world. The sense that, well, this is good because in a sense we are actually reaching out to more people, we're reaching out to a different demographic, etc., etc. But this is also true that the reality is absolutely different for theatre activists who actually produce political theatre in a subcontinent like India. For a lot of them, political theatre is impossible to imagine off the streets, right? And so it is, we recently celebrated, Badul Sarkar's birthday. We know that it is the legacy of Badul Sarkar, Sardar Hashmi, etc. All of these sort of doyens of political theatre in India. We could not imagine, in fact, a digital performance practice to take over from performance that actually occupied the streets, performance that had a direct and proximate relationship with the audience. So, for a lot of, I was just listening to an interview of Molashri Hashmi recently, and she speaks about how it is impossible for her to imagine in any way moving her theatre entirely to the digital space, or in any way to the digital space at all, because the only way she can imagine performing is, among the people. On the streets, in bazaars, out on street corners, etc., etc. So therefore, the privilege of digital democracy is also something that pertains to a certain kind of geopolitical sort of order, a certain kind of global location, and for a lot of performers in the context of such as India, this would be absolutely impossible to imagine. So therefore, whether or not you find sort of digital sort of performance or artistic practice in the virtual world as democratizing also depends largely on the access that you have to a certain kind of digital privilege, and that is what I would call it. Interestingly, however, to go back to the question of liveness, and this is one of the sort of fundamental, very early debates of performance studies theory, where in the early 90s, Peggy Phelan wrote a book called Unmarked, The Politics of Performance. And in one of the most crucial chapters in that book, which is called The Ontology of Performance, Representation Without Reproduction, this was written in 1993, she makes an argument for the ontology of performance as resting in its liveness. So she argues, and I'm just quoting from this very famous passage, performance's only life is in the present. It cannot be saved, recorded, documented, or otherwise participate in the circulation of representations of representations. Once it does so, it becomes something other than performance. To the degree that performance attempts to enter the economy of reproduction, it betrays and lessens the promise of its own ontology. Performance's being, like the ontology of subjectivity proposed here, becomes itself through disappearance. So she proposes something that is almost paradoxical. She says performance is performance because it disappears. Because you cannot save, reproduce, and circulate it. The pressures brought to bear on performance to succumb to the laws of the reproductive economy are enormous. For only rarely in this culture is the now to which performance addresses its deepest questions valued. So this is the notion that a limited number of people can get together in the here and now and have an experience of value, even if it is, like this session also is, being recorded and put online. So even if it is not being archived, that moment of the performance in the here and now, in its very ephemerality, has a specific kind of value. For only rarely in this culture is the now to which performance addresses its deepest questions valued. This is why the now is supplemented and buttressed by the documenting camera, the video archive. Performance occurs over a time which will not be repeated. It can be performed again, but this repetition itself marks it as different. The document of a performance, then, is only a spur to memory, an encouragement of memory, to become, for memory to become present. So I can, in fact, make a note of the performance. I can do a thick description of it. And if you go back to, if you try to remember Clifford Geertz's original passage on thick description, you'll remember that there's this very sort of this passing sentence that he writes, that the difference between the wink and the twitch is in fact not photographable. You cannot photograph it, right? Is the implication then that to actually detect the difference between the wink and the twitch, you not only need to find your feet in the culture within which the wink and the twitch are produced, the context of it, but also be present. So once again, the question of presence, the idea of presence returns in a certain sense. So you cannot record this distinction between the wink and the twitch because they're physically the same. But something about the cultural codes or the interconnected relationships that are formed ephemerally in that space where the wink, the parody of the wink and the twitch take place, give them that distinctiveness of meaning, right? So there's something that in fact cannot be recorded. So in a sense, the notion that you can in fact record a performance, you can in fact circulate it. But Phelan's argument is that that record is only a kind of mnemonic device. It's a note. It cannot in fact take the status of the performance. This, of course, was right away argued. Within 3 years in 1996, a performance studies scholar called Philip Auslander writes an essay on liveness where he directly refutes Peggy Phelan and says that, in a sense, she makes a virtue out of marginality, and she seems to suggest that, in a sense, performance is marginality. And this suggestion Phelan does make, that this resistance to reproduction, in fact, makes performance somehow resistant to sort of capitalist production and reproduction and circulation. So in a sense, this idea of presence, the fact that there is something that in fact cannot be made into an object, which can be circulated, which can be consumed, in that sense, allows performance ontologically somehow to resist capitalist logic. There was that suggestion in Phelan's argument. And Auslander reacts very badly to this. He says, you know, that Phelan makes a virtue out of marginality. He kind of suggests this kind of romantic, pristine status for performance, which it cannot have in today's day and age. He says that she seems to suggest that performance is only continued existences in the audience's memory, and it is able to sidestep reproduction and mediatization altogether. And then Auslander actually goes to show that the major performances that Phelan uses in order to establish her points, those pieces of performance, in fact, the one performed by a performance artist called Angelica Festa, are already mediatized pieces. So there is this imagination of a pristine performance that resists a sort of the impurity or the contamination of technological mediatization is in fact a myth. So Phelan has this rigorous commitment to the ontology of liveness, but Auslander doubts whether any cultural discourse can stand outside the ideologies of capital and reproduction. So in a sense, it is almost as if performance is permanently under threat from a technological and aesthetic contamination by mediatization. So I just quote briefly from Auslander. Our critique must deal realistically with the cultural economy within which representation and reproduction occur. An economy that is, at least in the West and in the technocratic East, thoroughly dominated by repetition and mediatization. Cultural criticism must walk a tightrope between uncritical acceptance or cynical celebration of new technologies and cultural configurations on one hand, and a nostalgic commitment to categories that are very nearly obsolete on the other. So he's then going on to say something very crucial. He says that when we talk about the live today, we only talk about live as a category because we have the possibility of recording. So the live is that which can be recorded. So the live as a category, in fact, is constituted by the possibility of recording and reproduction. So therefore, for Greek theatre, there was no category called the live because the possibility of recording does not exist. So the category of the recorded, the mediatized, is in fact co-constituted by this co-constitutes the category of the live. So he says that I want to problematize the binary logic on which the positions I have quoted are based. For The live and the mediatized are not in a relation of opposition, not in an antagonistic relation. And this is constantly sort of harped upon by Figel's vocabulary of encroachment, Pavis's of domination and contamination, and Blau's of threat. So these are all theorists who've written about liveness and mediatization. In the melodrama implied by these analyses, virtuous live performance is menaced by evil mediatization. Liveness is depicted as engaged in a life and death struggle with its insidious other. And from this point of view, once live's performance succumbs to mediatization, it loses its ontological integrity. So I skip over this a little bit. Liveness, as we understand it, was unthinkable by the Greeks for this reason, because the possibility of recording Greek performance does not exist. The live has always been classified as that which can be recorded. So in a sense, he's saying that it is this binary logic itself is a result of a certain kind of possibility of recording and reproducing and circulating performance through mediatized technologies. Much later, of course, so this debate continues over time. Phelan herself sort of revises her position a little bit. Much later, when we look at performance theorists like younger performance theorists like Michael Bleecker, writing in her book Visuality in the Theatre in 2008, she proposes something called the presence effect. She says that we, meaning the younger generation of performance theorists, tend to take a certain distance from the celebration of unmediated presence and directness that characterized early performance theory. The term presence, when used at all, is placed between quotation marks or replaced by notions like presence effect. Presence is now understood as necessarily rhetorical and always relying on representation. That is, presence relies on other signifiers and thus remains within the realm of the already constructed. So presence also becomes a certain kind of a discursive effect. So this debate is a long debate in performance studies. There have been many back and forths, many revisions and new visions, etc., etc. But in a strange way, in the present context, because of the pandemic, these debates have become far, far more sort of urgent in a certain way. So is there something that we are losing when we move performance to digital medium, in fact? So I will speak briefly then of two other points. One is so to just wrap up the performance part of the I do have about, how much time do I have?
5 to 7 minutes.
5 to 7 minutes. Okay. So to just wrap up the performance part of the debate. So another very important performance studies theorist, Diana Taylor, writes one of her most important books is called The Archive and the Repertoire. And this book, in fact, sets the terms, written in the early 2000s, sets the terms of how we think of archive in relationship to embodied performance. And she's speaking about altering the field of performance by saying that performance is not merely an object of knowledge, but in fact a way of knowing the world. So performance also is autonomously a way of producing knowledge about the world. And not all of this knowledge that exists in the embodied repertoire may necessarily be translated to a textual archive. So Diana Taylor in 2010 writes an essay called Foreseeable Futures, where she's actually thinking about the futures of the world. And she says, in many senses, the digital archive, or the modes in which we experience or produce knowledge in the digital world, mimic elements of both the traditional archive and the traditional repertoire. So she says that, just give me a second to find the, yes. So in some senses, the ephemerality of the repertoire, which is embodied performance, is mimicked by digital modes of communication. But on the other hand, the ability to amass enormous vast resources and data also mimics, in some senses, the traditional archive. So there is that sort of straddling between the two worlds. But Taylor goes on to say that the trouble is, and she's actually part of this huge digital archive of performance, live performances which are recorded and disseminated. And she's talking about her experience of having been part of creating that digital archive for Latin American performance. And she speaks of how there is, in fact, within us a resistance to accepting the fact that what we know, and this is her sentence, what we know is radically altered by how we know it. So she then goes to a scholar called Catherine Hales and borrows a term called the skeuomorph from Catherine Hales, where this term actually indicates a design function that is no longer functional in itself, but that refers back to a feature that was functional at an earlier time. So she gives a very simple example. So a design feature that is no longer functional, but evokes the memory of something that was functional at an earlier time. So something obsolete that used to work before doesn't work anymore, but the design feature reminds you of that object. So for example, when we empty the recycle bin on our desktop, there is a sound of a flushing toilet sometimes, right? So there is the sense that we got rid of the trash. Or an emptying bucket, let us say. Or, for example, when we open our Gmail, we have these little envelope, sort of icons of envelopes next to it. So we all know that there are no envelopes any longer. When we are getting the mail in our inboxes, it is not, in fact, a paper enclosed in another piece of paper. It is something that is happening, digitally. But that envelope, in fact, becomes a kind of skeuomorph. For that sound of the flushing toilet is a kind of skeuomorph because um, these features remind us of earlier modes of existing, living, communicating, etc., which no longer work, but give us, through memory, a sense of continuity with absolutely new technologies, which we are unfamiliar with, the implications of which we, in fact, may be unfamiliar with. So she writes, now we're entering Web 3.0 with interactive functions that move our memories of being able to annotate, chat, and work collaboratively online. My memory invoked by my documents assures me that I'm still part of an uninterrupted system of knowledge production that has only been shifted to another, faster, more efficient platform. However, this is not the case, which means that we feel that it's the same mode of knowledge production, the same mode of dissemination. We've just upgraded it. That's the word, right? We've accelerated it. We've put it into different forms. So the knowledge remains the same. It is simply that we have moved into a technological mode that is sort of slightly more efficient. Now, the skeuomorphs, in fact, these design features, in fact, enable us to hold on to the sense of continuity and not experience a kind of digital vertigo. But what Taylor is suggesting is that this, in fact, is not the case. There is, in fact, no such continuity, right? Perhaps what we know is radically altered by how we know it. And the implications of that we have not even been able to fathom. I think something similar can be said of all those practitioners and theoreticians of performance who are now trying to conjecture what would it mean to move to digital platforms. A lot of practitioners and theorists in the first world are wondering this because, in a sense, in a sense, this kind of being a digital native is also a function of where you're located in the global sort of economic order. Similar ideas of digital classrooms don't quite work in the subcontinent, as we know. Recently, I read this news about a village in Himachal Pradesh where a man had sold both his cows so that he could buy a smartphone for his daughter, who was attending school and who needed the smartphone to attend her digital sort of classes, and those two cows were the only source of income that this man had. So the stakes of this kind of digital, becoming a digital native, are far higher, sort of depending on which class, race, global sort of geographical location, gender, and age also that you come from. So therefore that is sort of important. But the thing that when we move to digital performance, it is not just that we are taking performance to a different medium, but we might be radically altering, in some senses, what the nature of performance, watching performance, proximity, reciprocity, etc., etc., might be in the digital mode. Okay, to briefly conclude, I had another whole section to talk about where I wanted to talk about assembly and political protest and the idea of performance in political protest. So I keep thinking of Judith Butler's 2011 essay, Bodies in Alliance and the Politics of the Street, which she wrote in the sort of as the Arab Spring was unfolding. And that has later on become a book. Notes towards a performative theory of assembly, performance theory of assembly, where she actually is speaking of a certain, in the Occupy movements, a certain breaking down of the traditional sort of notions of public and private that had sort of been embedded in political thought from the Greeks onwards. So this notion that the polis is a place where a certain kind of rational political action and speech are exercised, and the homestead and the domestic sphere where the women and slaves belong is a space for sort of social gregariousness, biological reproduction, but not in fact rational thought. And the distinction between two modes of life, rational political life, and Zoe, which is just species life in a certain way, is also is related to this kind of distinction. Not going into details about that. In a sense, Butler is saying that this distinction also exists in much later European political theories, including Hannah Arendt. But she says in the Occupy movements, in a certain way, what they do is that they bring corporeality into the public space in a way that has not been done ever before. So by occupying public space in such a way, these movements, in fact, bring all of those private corporeal activities of the body, eating, sleeping, defecating, copulating, into the open political space. And the occupation of this sort of space becomes a way in which this mode of corporeality, which was meant to be a sort of left outside the sphere of political action, rational speech, and thought, is in fact made political. So, in a sense, the presence of the body then becomes political in itself. So, if you read this essay, you will see that this idea is sort of proposed very, very strongly, and then it takes greater shape in the book that she writes later. Um, so she talks about a space where the legitimacy of the state is brought into question precisely by that way of appearing in public. The body itself exercises a right that is no right. In other words, it exercises a right that is being actively contested and destroyed by a military force, and which, in its resistance to force, articulates its persistence and its right to persistence. Right. So by just living in that public space, right? And this would resonate many sort of few years back for us in the context of, let's say, Kashmir or Manipur in the Indian sort of subcontinent, because the space of appearance, where women in fact have largely been involved in these kinds of movements of, so whether it be the parents of the disappeared persons in Kashmir or the mothers who protested outside Kangla in Manipur, this occupying of public space in itself becomes a kind of political act. But we know just before the pandemic hit us that Shaheen Bagh was actually uh, was holding its own as an Occupy movement of a certain kind. In Delhi, it had the authorities at a loss about what to do, how to encounter this, and we know that it was spurring in a certain sense. It was a gesture that was infectious, that was spreading across the country. There was Park Circus in Kolkata. There were other sort of cities which were actually erupting in similar Occupy protests. What the pandemic did, in a sense, is that it brought this space of occupation at one blow to a close. And we'll see that in the last 4 months, all the draconian measures of the state, including repressive arrests, including the passing of laws, whether it be about education or about environment, sort of arresting activists, putting them in deplorable conditions in prison. All of this has in fact accelerated to a great degree with the solid knowledge that occupying public space is not a possibility. We know that in similar conditions in the US, the George Floyd murder actually sprouted a kind of protest that drove the president into a bunker. But nothing similar has happened in this case. But the question is, my question that I put to you is that in a certain sense, we'll see that with the migrant crisis that happened right after the lockdown was announced within a sort of interval of 4 hours by the Prime Minister of this country, thousands were walking, crowding into rail stations. We have sort of dispatches from prisons where political prisoners like Gautam Lakha were actually in situations where 350 people were scouted into 3 or 4 schoolrooms. So there is, in fact, assembly, except the fact is that the assembly is happening on the state's terms. There are those who have the privilege of affording social distance, who choose safety over a certain kind, and it's not a question of choice. I mean, nobody wants to die. I understand that. The point is that there are those who cannot afford it. But the assembly, in fact, nothing has been done to prevent this kind of absolutely precarious assembly in rail stations, in prisons, in hospitals that are poorly supplied by the state. So in a sense, whatever little agency we had to organize assembly has been taken away from the space of public protest and performance to the modes in which the state enjoins it. And the state will, in fact, interpolate, will, in fact, will, in fact, demand a certain kind of assembly, perhaps in the way that Achille Mbembe talks about in his book on the post-colony, through a mode of mutual zombification in the near future. I'm not entirely sure what one is required to do in order to sidestep that zombification, but these are very, very urgent questions. And like I said, the skeuomorphs are not going to help after a point. There is no familiarity in this terrain. We are actually stepping into spaces that we have not encountered any longer. So the comfort of memory telling us that, well, this is just like that, is perhaps a certain kind of illusion. So we'll stop here, and I'll stop here and maybe I'll take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I think we lost connection again from Dr. Anirban Das. Professor Shubhro Shaha, are you there? Will you please connect with Professor Das? Kollol and Shom Shubhro, will you please help?
Yes, I'm
yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you. So we don't have any questions in the chat box right now. We will carry on with the discussion in later half when Professor Das joins. So we'll move ahead, and we have